Some losses cut so deep they shape the rest of your days. For 30 years, Silas Duvall carried the weight of losing his wife and unborn child in a train fire that left nothing but ashes and questions. Now, with silver in his beard and time running short, he spent his fortune on something everyone called foolish, a burned-out railroad car sitting forgotten in the desert. But Silas wasn't buying scrap metal. He was buying hope. That rusty Pullman car was the last piece of the train that took everything from him. Most folks would have walked away decades ago, but not Silas. He believed answers were waiting inside those charred walls. What he found would shake him to his core and offer him something he never thought possible. But would the truth set him free or destroy what little peace he had left? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted the Nevada desert in shades of amber and rust, casting long shadows across the Duvall ranch that stretched toward the horizon like fingers reaching for something just out of grasp. Silas Duvall stood on his wraparound porch, coffee growing cold in his weathered hands, staring at the object that had consumed his thoughts for the past 3 months, a charred railroad car sitting like a wounded beast among the sagebrush, 200 yards from his front door. At 72, Silas carried himself with the careful dignity of a man who had learned to bear weight that never got lighter. His shoulders, though still broad from decades of ranch work, curved slightly inward, as if protecting something precious and broken inside his chest. The silver in his beard caught the early light, and his blue eyes, once as clear as mountain lakes, now held the clouded depth that comes from looking too long at what can't be changed. Around his neck, hidden beneath his worn flannel shirt, hung a thin gold chain. At its end rested his wife's wedding ring, the metal warm against his skin from 30 years of constant wear. He touched it now, a gesture as automatic as breathing, feeling the smooth band that had once circled Elena's finger during their brief, brilliant months together. Elena Maria Santos had walked into his life like morning light breaking over the mountains, sudden, transformative, and absolutely necessary. They'd met at a church social in the spring of 1893, when Silas was a young rancher with more ambition than sense, and Elena was the new schoolteacher who spoke Spanish to the Mexican children and English to everyone else, switching between languages like a singer moving through different melodies. She had dark hair that caught fire in the sunlight, and a laugh that could make a man forget his own name. But it was her eyes that captured Silas Brown like rich earth after rain, holding depths that suggested both joy and sorrow, as if she'd learned early that life gives and takes in equal measure. They'd courted through that summer with the intensity of people who recognize something rare when they find it. Elena would ride out to the ranch on Sunday afternoons, bringing books and reading aloud, while Silas worked with the horses. She had a voice like honey over warm biscuits, and she could make even the driest passages from Dickens sound like poetry. By autumn, they were married in a simple ceremony at the little church in Millfield, with Elena wearing a dress she'd sewn herself from white cotton and carrying wildflowers Silas had picked at dawn. The whole town turned out, charmed by the schoolteacher who'd tamed the confirmed bachelor everyone thought would grow old alone. Their happiness filled the ranch house like music. Elena planted a garden behind the kitchen, growing tomatoes and chilies and herbs whose names Silas couldn't pronounce, but whose scents made the whole place feel like home. She taught him Spanish words, while he showed her how to read the weather in the color of the sky. In the evenings, they'd sit on this same porch, Elena's head against his shoulder, planning the family they'd build together in this good, wide land. When she told him about the baby in December, Silas thought his heart might burst from the sheer weight of his good fortune. Elena glowed with the news, her hand constantly finding her still flat belly, her smile holding secrets about the future they'd create together. But happiness, Silas had learned, could be as fragile as morning frost. The train fire happened on a cold February night in 1894. Elena had gone to visit her cousin in Sacramento, a trip they'd planned for months before they knew about the baby. The cousin was getting married, and Elena insisted she had to be there, despite Silas's gentle protests about the long journey. "It's just 1 week, mi amor," she'd said, standing on tiptoe to kiss his worried frown away. "The baby and I will be back before you have time to miss us." But they never came back. The newspaper reported it in stark, merciless language. Westbound passenger train derailed and caught fire 15 miles east of Millfield, all aboard presumed lost due to intensity of blaze. No survivors found. 23 souls, including his Elena and their unborn child, reduced to a handful of words in black ink. Silas had ridden out to the wreckage that next morning, arriving to find nothing but twisted metal and ash scattered across the desert like the remnants of a terrible dream. The fire had burned so hot that it turned sand to glass in places, creating a scene so complete in its destruction that even the railroad investigators could do little more than shake their heads and file their reports. No bodies were recovered. The fire had consumed everything: wood, metal, bone, hope. Elena and their baby had simply vanished into smoke and memory, leaving Silas with nothing but questions that had no answers, and a grief so profound it threatened to swallow him whole. For months afterward, he'd haunted that spot, searching through the debris with his bare hands until Jake Morrison, his foreman and closest friend, physically carried him away. Jake had worked for Silas's father and stayed on when Silas inherited the ranch. He was a man of few words but deep loyalty, and he'd appointed himself Silas's keeper during those dark months when grief made a man forget to eat or sleep or care whether he lived through another day. "Ain't nothing more to find there, son," Jake had said with the gentle firmness of someone who'd seen what loss could do to a man. "You keep digging in that ash. You're gonna bury yourself right alongside 'em." But Jake was wrong about there being nothing to find. Silas had discovered something in those ashes, something the investigators had missed a will to survive that he didn't know he possessed. The ranch became his salvation and his penance. He threw himself into the work with single-minded determination, expanding the operation until the Duvall name was known throughout 3 counties. Cattle prices, feed costs, water rights, these became the language he spoke instead of love. He learned to read profit margins like other men read scripture, and he built his wealth $1 at a time, one decision at a time, one day survived at a time. The years passed like seasons, sometimes harsh, sometimes gentle, but always moving towards something he couldn't name. He watched other men marry, raise families, grow old, surrounded by grandchildren, while he remained alone in the big house that Elena had filled with laughter for such a brief time. People in Millfield respected Silas Duvall, but they also whispered about him. The rich widower who never remarried, never courted, never seemed to want anything more than what he could buy with money. Some called him eccentric. Others, more generous, called him devoted. But Silas knew what he was, a man living in the space between what was and what might have been, counting his days in the quiet rhythm of routine and the steady accumulation of wealth that meant nothing without someone to share it with. Now, at 72, with more money than he could spend in 3 lifetimes and a loneliness that had become his most faithful companion, Silas had done something that confirmed every whispered suspicion about his state of mind. 3 months ago, he'd bought the railroad car. Not just any railroad car, the last remaining piece of the train that had carried Elena to her death. It had taken him 2 years to track down through railroad records and scrap dealers, and another 6 months to negotiate its purchase from a man in Arizona who thought Silas was either crazy or criminal for wanting such a thing. The car had cost him more than most men made in a decade, but money was just numbers on paper. What mattered was that it was here now, sitting in his desert like a monument to everything he'd lost and everything he still hoped to find. Dr. Samuel Hendricks, who'd been tending to the people of Millfield for 40 years and to Silas's health for the last 20, had made his feelings clear during their last visit. "Silas, as your friend and your doctor, I'm telling you this isn't healthy," Sam had said, his kind eyes reflecting genuine worry. "Buying that car, bringing it here, where you have to see it every day, you're reopening wounds that took decades to heal." But Sam didn't understand. The wounds had never healed. They'd just been covered over, like painting over rust. And now, with time running shorter and the weight of years pressing down on him like winter sky, Silas needed answers more than he needed peace. Jake understood even less. The old cowboy had been with Silas through everything: the loss, the building of the ranch, the long years of quiet grief. He'd watched his boss turn into a stranger, someone who smiled and spoke and made decisions, but never quite seemed to be fully present, as if part of him had died in that fire and never been properly buried. "Boss, I've stood by you through everything," Jake had said the day they delivered the railroad car, his weathered face creased with concern. "But this thing sitting on our land like some kind of tombstone, it ain't right. It ain't healthy. And Elena, God rest her soul, wouldn't want you torturing yourself like this." Perhaps Jake was right. Perhaps Dr. Hendricks was right. Perhaps the whole town of Millfield was right to whisper about old Silas Duvall finally losing his grip on reality. But as Silas stood on his porch in the growing morning light, watching the shadows shift around the railroad car, he felt something he hadn't experienced in 30 years: hope. Not the bright, uncomplicated hope of youth, but the deeper, more complicated hope of a man who'd learned that sometimes the only way forward is through the very thing you've spent a lifetime trying to avoid. Inside that car were answers. He felt it in his bones, in the way the desert wind whispered around its rusted frame, in the way the morning light caught the broken windows like tears on an old man's face. Elena was gone. Their baby was gone. 30 years of his life were gone. But somewhere in the charred remains of that Pullman car, the truth was waiting for him. And truth, Silas had learned, was the only thing left worth buying. The door to the railroad car fought him like it was guarding secrets. Rust had welded the metal hinges into stubborn defiance, and Silas had to throw his full weight against the warped frame before it finally surrendered with a groan that echoed across the desert morning. The smell hit him first: 30 years of desert heat, baking charcoal and ash into something that caught in his throat and made his eyes water. But underneath that acrid scent lay something else, something that made his heart stumble in his chest. Roses, faint as a whisper, but unmistakably the scent of Elena's perfume, the one she'd saved for special occasions and Sunday church. Silas stepped inside, and the past rose up around him like floodwater. The car's interior told the story of that terrible night, in burn marks and twisted metal. What had once been elegant burgundy velvet seats were now blackened skeletons, their horsehair stuffing scattered like grey snow across warped floorboards. The ceiling had partially collapsed, letting in fingers of sunlight that illuminated motes of dust dancing in the still air. But it was more than destruction that filled this space. It was presence, the weight of lives interrupted mid-sentence, mid-breath, mid-dream. Silas could almost hear the phantom echo of conversations that would never be finished, laughter that had died with the flames. He moved carefully through the debris, his boots crunching on glass from shattered windows. Each step felt like trespassing on sacred ground, but he pressed forward, drawn by something stronger than respect for the dead. He was searching for proof of life, for evidence that Elena had been here, that their love had existed in this space before the fire consumed it. Near what had once been the center of the car, his foot struck something that rang with a different note than broken glass. Silas knelt, brushing away ash with hands that trembled despite his efforts to steady them. His fingers closed around something small and round, metal warmed by decades of desert sun. A pocket watch. The silver case was tarnished black, but still intact. Silas turned it over in his palm, feeling the weight of it, the solid reality of something that had survived when everything else had been reduced to memory and ash. With careful fingers, he pried open the case. The face was cracked, spider web of lines, but the hands were still visible, frozen at 11:47, the same time the newspapers had reported for the derailment. But that wasn't what made Silas's breath catch in his throat. Engraved inside the case, in script so ornate it had survived the fire's attempt to erase it, were the words, "To Thomas Chen, faithful service, Nevada and California Railroad Company, 1890. Thomas Chen, the conductor." Silas had read the passenger manifests 100 times in those first months after the fire, memorizing every name like a prayer for the dead. Thomas Chen, aged 34, had been the conductor on that train. According to the railroad's records, he died along with everyone else when the cars derailed and caught fire. But here was his watch, and the hands told a different story. The official report stated that the train had derailed at 11:12 p.m. when a damaged rail caused the cars to jump the tracks and overturn. The fire had started immediately from overturned oil lamps and spread so quickly that no one could escape. Death, the investigators concluded, would have been swift, but this watch showed 11:47, 35 minutes after the crash. 35 minutes was time enough to wind a watch, time enough to live, time enough to hope for rescue that never came, or perhaps Silas's heart hammered against his ribs at the thought, time enough to escape. He closed the watch case and slipped it into his vest pocket, feeling its weight settle against his chest like a small, warm secret. If Thomas Chen had survived the initial crash, if he'd lived long enough to wind his watch in those final moments, what else might the official story have gotten wrong? Standing in that burned-out car, surrounded by the ghosts of that terrible night, Silas felt something shift inside him, a crack in the wall of acceptance he'd built around his grief. For 30 years, he'd believed Elena and their baby had died instantly, that their suffering had been brief. He'd found comfort in that belief, terrible as it was. But comfort built on lies was no comfort at all. The sound of boots on gravel outside made him turn toward the door. Jake Morrison's silhouette filled the opening, his hat brim casting shadows across a face creased with worry. "Boss." Jake's voice carried the careful tone of a man approaching a spooked horse. "You been in here near 2 hours. Thought maybe you might want some water." Silas looked around the interior of the car, surprised to discover that Jake was right. The sun had climbed high enough to change the angle of light streaming through the broken windows, and his knees ached from kneeling on the hard floor. Time had slipped away from him like sand through fingers. "I found something, Jake," Silas said, his voice rough from breathing ash and emotion. He pulled out the pocket watch, cradling it in his palm. This belonged to the conductor. Jake stepped carefully into the car, his weathered features skeptical. "Lot of things survived that fire, boss. Don't mean nothing special. Look at the time." Jake squinted at the watch face, then at Silas. "So, the train derailed at 11:12. This watch stopped at 11:47. That's 35 minutes, Jake. 35 minutes after the crash." The old cowboy was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving from the watch to Silas's face and back again. Finally, he shook his head. "Could mean a lot of things. Could mean the watch was broken before the crash. Could mean the heat affected it somehow. It means someone was alive long enough to wind it," Silas interrupted, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised him. "Someone survived that initial crash, Jake. If the conductor lived for 35 minutes, maybe others did too. Maybe Elena." "Boss." Jake's voice cut through the rising hope like a knife through fabric. "Elena's been gone 30 years. You buried an empty coffin and said words over it. You can't bring her back by torturing yourself with what-ifs." But Silas wasn't listening to Jake's reasonable words. He was listening to the whisper of possibility that had awakened in his chest, the first flutter of hope he'd felt since that terrible morning when he'd ridden out to find nothing but ash and twisted metal. If the conductor had survived the crash, if he'd lived long enough to wind his watch in those final moments, then the official story was incomplete. And if the official story was incomplete, then maybe, just maybe, Elena's story wasn't finished either. "I need to talk to Sheriff Williams," Silas said, slipping the watch back into his pocket. "He worked that investigation. He'll have records." "Boss, Sheriff Williams has been dead 10 years. His deputy, Crawford, runs things now, and he wasn't even born when that train burned." "Then I'll talk to someone who was there, someone who remembers." Jake caught Silas's arm as he moved toward the door, his grip firm but gentle. "What if you find what you're looking for, and it ain't what you want to hear? What if Elena did suffer? What if—" "Then I'll know," Silas said simply. "After 30 years of questions, Jake, I'll finally know." He stepped out of the railroad car and into the bright desert morning, the conductor's watch warm against his chest, and something that felt dangerously like hope blooming in the space where certainty used to live. Behind him, Jake followed with the heavy step of a man who'd seen his boss make this journey from acceptance back into the country of the heartbroken, and who knew there might be no returning this time. The investigation that had ended 30 years ago was about to begin again. 3 days of methodical searching had yielded nothing but splinters and disappointment until Silas's fingers found the silk ribbon caught on a window latch near the back of the car. The faded blue fabric was no bigger than his thumb, but he recognized it instantly. Elena had worn a ribbon just like this in her hair the morning she'd left for Sacramento, tying it in a simple bow that had made her look young as springtime. His hands shook as he carefully worked the delicate silk free from the twisted metal. 30 years in the desert should have reduced fabric to dust, but this small piece had somehow survived, protected in the shadow of the window frame where wind and sun couldn't reach it. The blue had faded to the color of winter sky, but the texture remained smooth and cool between his fingers, carrying with it the ghost of Elena's touch. Standing there in the morning light streaming through broken windows, Silas could see her as clearly as if she stood beside him. Elena in their bedroom, humming softly as she braided her dark hair and secured it with this very ribbon. Elena laughing as he tried to help and only made tangles worse. Elena standing on tiptoe to kiss him goodbye, the ribbon already coming loose from her hurried movements. "I'll be more careful with it when I get to Margaret's," she'd promised, tucking a strand behind her ear. "She always knows how to make everything look proper." But the ribbon hadn't made it to Margaret's wedding. It had made its way here, to this burned-out car, caught on metal in a way that spoke of struggle, of someone moving desperately in the dark. Elena had been conscious during the fire. She'd been alive and fighting to escape. The implications hit him like a physical blow. Elena hadn't died peacefully in the initial crash. She'd lived through the derailment, through the first moments of the fire, long enough to move through the car, long enough to catch her ribbon on the window trying to get out. Silas sank onto what remained of a seat, the ribbon clutched in his fist, and allowed himself to feel the full weight of what this meant. For 30 years, he'd told himself that Elena's death had been instant, that she and the baby hadn't suffered. It was cold comfort, but it was comfort nonetheless. Now that fragile piece crumbled like ash in his hands. "Mr. Duvall?" The voice from outside the car startled him from his dark thoughts. Silas looked up to see a figure silhouetted in the doorway, a man in a brown suit with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Sheriff Crawford," Silas said, slipping the ribbon carefully into his vest pocket beside the conductor's watch. "What brings you out to my place?" Deputy Sheriff Tom Crawford stepped into the car with the cautious movements of someone entering a crime scene. He was a lean man in his 40s, with intelligent eyes and the kind of mustache that suggested he took his responsibilities seriously. "Had a few folks in town express some concerns," Crawford said carefully, "about you spending so much time out here, poking around in old business. Thought maybe we should have a conversation." "Concerned? About what exactly?" "About your state of mind, Mr. Duvall. about whether this fixation on the past might not be, Crawford paused, choosing his words, might not be healthy for a man your age. Silas felt anger rise in his throat like bile. My state of mind is just fine, Sheriff, and my age doesn't make me incompetent. No, sir, it doesn't. But grief can make a man see things that aren't there, especially when that grief is 30 years old and still fresh as an open wound. What if I told you I've found evidence that the official investigation into this fire was incomplete? Crawford's eyebrows rose. I'd say that's a serious accusation, Mr. Duvall. The railroad company conducted a thorough investigation. The territorial authorities reviewed their findings. Everyone concluded the same thing: tragic accident, no survivors. Silas pulled the pocket watch from his vest, holding it where Crawford could see the stopped hands. This belonged to the conductor. Time of death was recorded as 11:12 when the train derailed, but this watch stopped at 11:47. Crawford examined the watch with professional interest, but his expression remained skeptical. Could be any number of explanations for that. Heat can affect timepieces in strange ways. Could have been wound wrong, could have been damaged before the crash. Or someone could have wound it after the crash. Someone who lived long enough to hope for rescue. Mr. Duvall, I understand your need to find meaning in this tragedy, but sometimes accepting what happened is the only way to find peace. Peace! Silas's voice rose, echoing in the confined space. You think I've had peace these 30 years? You think waking up every morning to an empty house, eating meals alone, talking to myself like some crazy hermit, you think that's been peaceful? Crawford's expression softened. No, sir, I don't imagine it has been. But opening old wounds isn't going to bring your wife back. Maybe not. But it might bring me the truth. The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, studying Silas with eyes that had seen enough of human nature to recognize when words wouldn't change a man's mind. Finally, he nodded. All right, Mr. Duvall, I can see you're determined to pursue this, but I want you to understand something. If you start spreading stories about cover-ups and incomplete investigations, you're going to ruffle some important feathers. The railroad company still has influence in this state. They don't like their competence questioned. Are you warning me off, Sheriff? I'm advising you to be careful, and if you do find something real, not just wishful thinking, you bring it to me first. Don't go talking to newspaper reporters or railroad officials or anyone else. You understand? Silas nodded, though he wasn't sure he meant it. Crawford seemed decent enough, but he was still part of the system that had declared Elena's death a closed case 30 years ago. After the sheriff left, Silas remained in the car as the afternoon heat built around him. He pulled out Elena's ribbon again, holding it up to catch the light. Such a small thing to carry such weight, but he'd learned that the most important truths often came wrapped in fragments: a watch that told the wrong time, a ribbon that shouldn't exist, the growing certainty that everything he'd been told about that night was a lie. Jake found him there as the sun was setting, sitting in the ruins of what had once been a Pullman car's elegant interior, holding a piece of blue silk like it contained the secrets of the universe. "Boss, you missed lunch and dinner. Mrs. Patterson left a plate on the porch, but the ants got to it." Silas looked up, realizing his old foreman's worried face was the first thing he'd really seen clearly all day. "I found something else, Jake. Another piece of the past you should probably leave buried." Elena's hair ribbon, caught on the window latch. Silas held up the silk, watching it flutter in the evening breeze. She was alive during the fire. She was trying to escape. Jake was quiet for a long time, his weathered features grave in the fading light. Finally, he sighed. "What are you going to do with that information, boss? Find out who else survived. Find out why the official story was wrong. Find out what really happened to my wife. And then what? What happens when you know?" Silas folded the ribbon carefully and slipped it back into his pocket. "Then maybe I can stop wondering and start living with the truth, whatever it is." But even as he said the words, Silas wasn't sure he believed them. The truth, he was beginning to understand, might be more terrible than anything his imagination had conjured in 30 years of sleepless nights. The wooden horse emerged from the ash like a prayer answered. Silas found it wedged beneath what had once been a passenger seat, its carved mane blackened but still intact. His breath caught as he recognized the careful craftsmanship Elena's work, made during the long winter evenings when her hands needed something to do while they talked about names for their coming child. She'd started with a simple block of pine, whittling during the quiet hours when the ranch settled into sleep around them. Each night he'd watched her fingers transform raw wood into something beautiful, something full of love and hope for the future they were building together. The horse's gentle expression, the flowing mane, the way its legs were positioned mid-gallop, all of it spoke of Elena's patient devotion to their unborn baby. "For when the little one is old enough to play," she'd said, running her fingers over the smooth wood, "every child should have something made with their mama's hands." But their child had never gotten old enough to play, or so Silas had believed. Now, holding the toy in his trembling hands, he realized how wrong he might have been about everything. Elena hadn't been carrying this horse for their unborn baby during that last trip to Sacramento. She'd been carrying it for a child who was already born, already walking, already old enough to treasure a wooden toy made with love. The implications crashed over him like cold water. Elena had lied to him about being pregnant. She'd had a child, a living, breathing child, who'd been on that train with her when it derailed and burned. A child who might have survived. Silas sank to his knees in the ash and debris. The wooden horse clutched against his chest and allowed himself to feel the full weight of Elena's deception. Their entire marriage had been built on a lie. The pregnancy he'd celebrated, the future they'd planned, the family he'd mourned for 30 years, none of it had been real. But if Elena had lied about being pregnant, what else had she lied about? "Mr. Duvall?" The voice came from outside the car, wavering with age, but carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. Silas looked up to see an elderly woman standing in the doorway, her white hair pinned beneath a faded sunbonnet, her dress clean but patched in several places. "Mrs. Henley," Silas said, recognizing Martha Henley from town. She'd been the postmistress for 40 years before retiring, and she had the kind of memory that kept track of everyone's business, whether they wanted it kept track of or not. "Heard you've been spending time out here," she said, stepping carefully into the car with the aid of a walking stick. "Thought maybe I should tell you about what I saw that night." Silas stood slowly, the wooden horse still in his hands. "What night, ma'am?" "The night the train burned, February 14th, 1894, Valentine's Day." Her eyes, still sharp despite her 80-some years, focused on the toy in his hands. "That's pretty workmanship. Your Elena always did have clever fingers." "You knew Elena?" "Child, I knew everyone who passed through Millfield in those days. Elena used to come to the post office regular-like, sending letters to someone down south. Always paid for the fastest service, always asked me to make sure they got where they were going safe." Silas felt his heart begin to race. Letters to whom? Never asked. "Not my business what folks write to their kin about, but I remember she stopped coming in about 2 weeks before that train burned." "Stopped sending letters altogether." Martha moved deeper into the car, her walking stick tapping against the warped floorboards. "That night, the night of the fire, I was sitting up with my youngest. He'd taken fevered, and I was bathing his forehead by the window when I seen someone running across the desert. Someone survived the crash? Can't say for certain it was from the train, but it was near midnight, and there wasn't much else out there that would have folks running through sagebrush in their nightclothes." Martha's eyes met his. "It was a woman, Mr. Duvall. A woman carrying something or someone in her arms." Silas's grip tightened on the wooden horse. "Did you tell the investigators?" "Tried to. But Sheriff Williams said I must have been mistaken, that the grief of seeing that fire had confused my old eyes." said it wasn't possible anyone could have survived such a blaze. Martha's voice carried the frustration of someone who'd been dismissed and not forgotten it. But I know what I saw. Someone got out of that train alive. Which direction were they running? South. Toward the border. Like they were heading for the old mission road that used to run down to Mexico. Mexico, where Elena had sent her mysterious letters, where someone might disappear and never be found if they wanted to start a new life. Mrs. Henley, why didn't you ever tell anyone else about this? Why come to me now? The old woman was quiet for a moment, studying Silas with eyes that had seen too much of life to be easily fooled. Because 30 years ago you were a young man torn apart by grief, and the truth might have killed you. But now you're an old man torn apart by questions, and maybe the truth is the only thing that can set you free. She turned to leave, then paused in the doorway. Your Elena was a good woman, Mr. Duvall. Whatever secrets she carried, whatever lies she told, they came from love, not malice. Sometimes love makes us do things that look like betrayal to folks who don't understand the whole story. After she left, Silas remained alone in the car as shadows lengthened across the desert floor. The wooden horse seemed to grow heavier in his hands, weighted with the possibility that Elena hadn't just lied about being pregnant, she'd lied about everything. Her past, her reasons for marrying him, perhaps even her love. But Martha Henley was right about one thing. Elena had been a good woman. Silas remembered her kindness to the Mexican children in town, the way she'd nursed sick animals back to health, the gentleness with which she'd treated everyone she met. Good women didn't build their lives on deception without powerful reasons. If Elena had been running toward Mexico that night, carrying someone in her arms, carrying the child who'd played with this wooden horse, then she'd had a reason bigger than her own happiness. She'd had a reason worth abandoning the husband who loved her, worth letting him mourn her death for 30 years, while she lived a different life under a different name. The question that haunted Silas now wasn't whether Elena had survived the fire. The question was why she'd chosen to let him believe she was dead, and whether the woman he'd loved had ever really existed at all. Outside, the desert wind picked up, whistling through the broken windows of the railroad car, and carrying with it the scent of sage and secrets that might never be fully understood. The torn manifest lay buried beneath a pile of charred wood near the front of the car, so damaged that Silas almost missed it entirely. Only the corner of what looked like official railroad letterhead caught his attention as he shifted debris that had fallen from the collapsed ceiling. When he carefully extracted the document, his hands trembling with excitement, he found himself holding a piece of the puzzle that changed everything he thought he knew about Elena's final journey. The passenger list was mostly illegible, scorched beyond recognition, but 3 names remained partially visible through the soot and water damage. The first 2 he recognized from the official records, Thomas Chen, the conductor, and James Morrison, a traveling salesman. But the 3rd name stopped his heart, Mrs. E. Santos, traveling with 1 child. Santos, not Duvall. Elena had been traveling under her maiden name. Silas sank onto a broken crate, the manifest fragment trembling in his weathered hands. Elena hadn't just lied about being pregnant. She'd lied about her identity, buying her ticket under a name that would ensure no one connected her to the wealthy rancher's wife from Millfield. This wasn't the impulsive trip to a cousin's wedding that she'd described to him. This was something planned, something deliberate, something that required hiding her true identity from the railroad company and anyone else who might be watching. But why? Why would Elena, his Elena, who'd sworn before God and witnesses to love and honor him, why would she deceive him so completely about something as simple as a trip to Sacramento? The answer came to him like a punch to the gut. She hadn't been going to Sacramento at all. She'd been running away. The realization hit him with such force that he had to press his hand against his chest to keep breathing. Elena had been planning to leave him. The pregnancy had been a lie. The cousins' wedding had been a lie. Probably everything about their life together had been a carefully constructed fiction, designed to what? Give her time to plan her escape? Give her access to his money and protection while she prepared for a different life? Silas felt 30 years of carefully maintained composure begin to crack. He'd built his entire adult life around the memory of Elena's love, around the belief that their brief marriage had been the one perfect thing in an imperfect world. He'd used that memory as a foundation for everything: his loneliness, his wealth, his refusal to love again. If Elena had never loved him at all, if their marriage had been nothing but an elaborate deception, then what was he? What had he been these 30 years but a fool mourning something that had never existed? "Boss," Jake's voice came from outside the car, cautious and concerned. "You been in there near 4 hours. Sun's getting mighty hot." Silas looked up, surprised to find that Jake was right. The light streaming through the broken windows had shifted from morning gold to harsh afternoon white, and his shirt was soaked with sweat. The manifest fragment was damp with perspiration from his clenched fist. "Jake," Silas called, his voice hoarse, "come in here. I need to ask you something." The old cowboy entered the car with his usual careful dignity, removing his hat and holding it respectfully in his hands. He'd known Elena too, had worked the ranch during their brief marriage, had been there to see the joy she'd brought to this place and the devastation her loss had caused. "Did Elena ever seem unhappy to you?" Silas asked without preamble. "During those months we were married, did she ever act like a woman planning to run away?" Jake's weathered face creased with confusion and concern. "Boss, what kind of question is that? Elena was the happiest woman I ever seen. She lit up like Christmas morning every time you walked in the room. But did she ever seem secretive? Like she was hiding something?" "Well," Jake paused, his hat brim rotating in his hands as he searched his memory. "There was that time she asked me about the roads south. Said she wanted to know about safe places to stop if a person was traveling alone down toward Mexico." Silas felt something cold settle in his stomach. "When was this?" "Maybe 2 weeks before she left for Sacramento. I told her it wasn't safe country for a woman traveling alone. Asked her why she wanted to know. She said she was just curious about the old mission trail, that she'd heard stories about the Spanish priests and wanted to understand the history of the territory." "And you believed her?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, studying Silas with eyes that had seen enough of life to recognize pain when it was staring him in the face. "Boss, I think maybe you need to step back from all this digging. You're finding things that are just going to hurt you. And Elena ain't here to explain her side of whatever story you're putting together in your head." But Silas couldn't step back. Not now. Not when he was so close to understanding the truth about the woman he'd loved and mourned for 30 years. "There's something else, Jake. Elena wasn't traveling under her married name. She bought her ticket as Mrs. E. Santos, her maiden name. Could be any number of reasons for that. Name one." Jake was quiet, his hat still rotating in his weathered hands. Finally, he sighed. "Maybe she was protecting you. Maybe whatever trouble she was running from, she didn't want it following her back to this ranch. Maybe using her maiden name was her way of keeping you safe." It was a generous interpretation, and Silas wanted desperately to believe it. But the evidence was mounting against the idea that Elena had been protecting anyone but herself. The mysterious letters to Mexico, the questions about southern roads, the false identity, the lie about being pregnant, all of it pointed to a woman with secrets, a woman with a past she'd hidden from her husband, a woman who'd been planning an escape from the very beginning. Dr. Hendricks had been right to worry about Silas's mental state, but the doctor had been worried about the wrong thing. He'd been concerned that Silas was losing his grip on reality. The truth was worse than madness. Silas was finding reality, and reality was destroying everything he'd believed about his life. As Jake left the car, shaking his head with the sad wisdom of someone who'd watched his friend dig his own emotional grave, Silas remained alone with the torn manifest and the growing certainty that Elena Santos Duvall had never been the woman he thought he'd married. The question now wasn't whether Elena had loved him. The question was whether she'd ever been real at all, or just another lie in a life apparently built on deception. The letter changed everything. Silas found it wedged behind a loose panel near what had once been a private sleeping compartment, the paper preserved by some miracle of positioning and desert air. The Spanish words were written in Elena's careful script. The ink faded but still legible in the late afternoon light, filtering through the broken windows. "Mi querida hija," it began. "My dear daughter." Silas read the letter 3 times before the full meaning penetrated the shock that had numbed his mind. Elena had been writing to a daughter, not an unborn child, not a cousin, but a living, breathing daughter she'd left behind somewhere in Mexico. A daughter who was waiting for her return. The letter was brief, but devastating in its implications. "My dearest Isabella, the time has come for us to be together again. I have found a way to leave this place safely, and soon we will start our new life where no one can hurt us. The man I married is good and kind, but he cannot protect us from your father's reach. We must disappear completely. It is the only way to keep you safe. I will come for you as planned. Trust no one until I arrive. Tell Tia Rosa that the arrangements are made, and we will leave for California as soon as I reach you. Your loving Mama." Silas's hands shook as he read the words again, each sentence hitting him like a physical blow. Elena hadn't been pregnant with his child. She'd been protecting a daughter from some previous relationship. She'd married him not for love, but as cover, as protection from someone dangerous enough that she'd been willing to fake her own death to escape. The wooden horse made sense now. Elena had been carrying it to Mexico for her daughter Isabella, a child who was old enough to play with toys, old enough to remember her mother's face, old enough to be waiting for a reunion that had been planned in secret. But the train fire had changed everything. Elena's carefully laid plans had literally gone up in smoke, and somehow through luck or determination or sheer desperation, she'd managed to escape the wreckage and continue her journey south. Without the luxury of a stage departure, without the safety of a cover story, she'd had to truly disappear, letting the world believe she'd died in the flames. Including Silas. He sat in the ruins of the railroad car as the sun sank toward the western mountains, the letter heavy in his hands despite its fragile weight. 30 years of grief, 30 years of building his life around the memory of Elena's love, 30 years of believing himself widowed by tragedy, all of it based on a lie. But was it entirely a lie? The letter spoke of Elena's husband as good and kind, suggested that leaving him caused her pain. Maybe she had loved him, in her way. Maybe the choice between protecting her daughter and staying with Silas had torn her apart as much as her loss had torn him apart. Or maybe that was just wishful thinking from a man who couldn't bear the idea that his entire life had been built on a foundation of deception. The sound of horses approaching pulled him from his dark thoughts. Through the broken windows, he could see 2 riders coming up the long drive to his house, Dr. Hendricks and Sheriff Crawford, their faces grim with purpose. By the time Silas emerged from the railroad car, they were waiting for him beside the porch, their horses stamping nervously in the growing twilight. "Silas," Dr. Hendricks said without preamble, "we need to have a conversation." "About what?" "About your recent behavior," Crawford answered. "About the concerns that have been raised regarding your mental state." Silas felt anger flare in his chest. "My mental state is fine, Sheriff. Better than it's been in years, actually." "Is it, Doctor?" Hendricks dismounted and approached with the careful movements of someone dealing with a potentially dangerous patient. "Because word around town is that you've been talking about conspiracies and cover-ups, making wild claims about evidence that supposedly proves the railroad investigation was incomplete. The evidence isn't wild, Doc, it's real, and it proves that people survived that train fire. Even if that's true, Crawford said. Even if someone survived the initial crash, they've been dead 30 years now. Whatever happened that night, it's over. It's time to let it rest. Rest? Silas laughed, but there was no humor in it. You want me to rest when I've just discovered that my wife lied about everything? When I've found proof that she was planning to abandon me from the moment she said, "I do." The two men exchanged glances, and Dr. Hendricks moved closer. Silas, what you're describing sounds like the kind of paranoid thinking that can develop when grief goes untreated for too long. Sometimes the mind creates elaborate explanations for loss because the simple truth that bad things happen to good people for no reason is too painful to accept. You think I'm making this up? Silas pulled the letter from his vest pocket, holding it where they could see Elena's handwriting. You think I'm imagining this? Crawford stepped forward, hand extended. May I see that? Silas hesitated, then handed over the letter. The sheriff read it carefully, his expression growing more troubled with each line. This is written in Spanish, Crawford said finally. How do I know this isn't just some old document you found somewhere else? How do I know you didn't write it yourself? Because it's in my wife's handwriting, you fool. Because it was hidden in that railroad car for 30 years, waiting for someone to find it. Or because grief and isolation have affected your judgment more than you realize, Doctor. Hendricks said gently, Silas, I've seen this before. Elderly patients who become convinced that their deceased loved ones are still alive, who see patterns and conspiracies where none exist. It's not uncommon, and it's not your fault. Silas stared at the two men, the doctor who delivered his wife's death certificate 30 years ago, the sheriff who represented the same system that had declared the case closed, and realized they would never believe him. To them, he was just a crazy old man chasing ghosts, too stubborn and too lonely to accept the truth. But they were wrong about what the truth was. Elena hadn't died in that fire. She'd escaped, fled to Mexico, reunited with the daughter she'd hidden from him. She'd built a new life, while he'd built his wealth and his sorrow in equal measure. The question that haunted him now was simple. If Elena was alive, if she'd survived the fire and lived all these years believing him to be part of her past, what was he going to do about it? As Crawford and Dr. Hendricks rode away, shaking their heads with the satisfied concern of men who'd done their duty, Silas stood in his dooryard, holding a letter that proved everything and convinced no one. But he didn't need to convince anyone else. He only needed to find the courage to do what Elena had done 30 years ago, disappear from his old life and start searching for the truth, no matter where it led him. The birth certificate was hidden in the false bottom of what had once been Elena's traveling case, discovered only when Silas accidentally dropped the charred leather bag and heard the hollow sound it made, hitting the railroad car's floor. His hands trembled as he worked the damaged latch free, revealing the small compartment Elena had used to hide her most precious documents. Isabella Maria Santos, born the 15th of March, 1885, in Guadalajara, Mexico. Father, Carlos Santos. Mother, Elena Maria Santos. Silas stared at the official document, his mind struggling to process what the dates meant. March 1885. The train fire had been in February 1894. If Isabella had been born in 1885, she would have been nearly 9 years old when she traveled with Elena on that doomed train. Not an infant, not an unborn child, but a little girl old enough to remember her mother's face, old enough to understand fear, old enough to help Elena escape from the burning wreckage. And if Isabella had been 9 years old in 1894, she would be 54 now, very much alive, very much a woman who might still remember the night her mother saved her from the fire and spirited her away to safety. But the birth certificate revealed something else that hit Silas like a physical blow. Carlos Santos, the man Elena had been running from, the dangerous father she'd mentioned in her letter. The name meant nothing to Silas, but the implications were staggering. Elena hadn't just been protecting her daughter from some vague threat. She'd been protecting Isabella from her own father, a man dangerous enough that Elena would fake her death rather than risk him finding them. The pieces of the puzzle began clicking into place with horrible clarity. Elena's mysterious arrival in Millfield with no family and few possessions, her reluctance to talk about her past, the way she'd sometimes startle when men raised their voices, the careful way she'd watch strangers who came to the ranch. She hadn't been escaping poverty or seeking a better life. She'd been running from a man who'd probably beaten her, who'd threatened her child, who'd made their lives in Mexico a living hell. Marrying Silas hadn't been about love, at least not entirely. It had been about safety, the protection of a respectable name, a wealthy husband, a place to hide while she made arrangements to bring Isabella north and start fresh. But something had gone wrong. Maybe Carlos had found them. Maybe the threat had become too immediate. Maybe Elena had realized that even marriage to a powerful rancher couldn't keep her daughter safe. So she'd planned the train trip, using her maiden name to avoid detection, intending to collect Isabella and disappear forever. The fire had been a terrible accident, but Elena, clever, desperate Elena, had used the chaos to accomplish what she'd planned all along. She'd let the world believe she was dead, ensuring that Carlos Santos would stop looking for her and Isabella, including Silas. Sitting in the ruins of the railroad car with the birth certificate in his hands, Silas felt the last of his illusions about his marriage crumble into ash. Elena had never loved him the way he'd loved her. She'd cared for him. Certainly, her letter suggested genuine affection, but their entire relationship had been built on her need for protection and his lonely heart's willingness to provide it. The worst part was that he couldn't even blame her. What choice did a woman have in 1893, alone with a child, fleeing from a dangerous man? Elena had done what she had to do to survive, to protect her daughter. If that meant deceiving a lovesick rancher, if that meant building a marriage on a foundation of half-truths and hidden purposes, then that was the price of Isabella's safety. But knowing Elena's reasons didn't ease the pain of realizing he'd been used. For 30 years, he'd mourned a love that had never fully existed. He'd built his entire identity around being Elena's devoted widower, the man who'd loved so completely that he could never love again. Now, he discovered he'd been playing a role in someone else's story, a bit player in Elena's desperate plan to save her daughter. Mr. Duvall. The voice from the doorway startled him. Silas looked up to see a small, elderly Mexican man standing in the late afternoon light, his weathered face kind but cautious. "Father Miguel Sandoval," the man said, removing his hat. "I serve the mission church in Guadalupe, just across the border. I heard that someone was asking questions about Elena Santos." Silas carefully folded the birth certificate and slipped it into his vest pocket. "You knew Elena?" "Si, I knew her, and her daughter. I performed the last rites when Elena died, and I helped raise Isabella afterward." The words hit Silas like a sledgehammer. "Elena is dead." Father Sandoval entered the car slowly, his dark eyes taking in the destruction around them. "She died 3 years after the fire. In 1897, consumption. The smoke she breathed that night, the hardships of starting over her body, never recovered. 3 years. Elena had lived for 3 years after the fire, long enough to see her daughter settled, long enough to know Isabella was safe. But she died believing Silas would never know the truth, never understand why she'd had to leave him. And Isabella? Isabella is alive and well. She lives in Guadalupe still, teaches at the school there. She has children of her own now. Grandchildren, too. She never married, but she's made a good life for herself." Father Sandoval paused, studying Silas with eyes that had seen too much suffering to be easily shocked. "She remembers you. She remembers me." Elena told her about the kind man who'd given them safety for a little while, the man who'd loved her mother even though he didn't know the whole truth. "Isabella always wondered if you were still alive, if you'd ever learned what really happened." Silas felt tears burn his eyes for the first time in decades. "Elena told her about me? In the end, see. When she was dying, she wanted Isabella to know that not all men were like Carlos Santos. That there had been one man who'd treated her with kindness and respect, who'd given her hope that Isabella might someday find that kind of love for herself. Why are you telling me this? Why now? Father Sandoval was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folding his hat brim. Because Isabella has been waiting 57 years to thank the man who helped save her mother's life. Because Elena's last wish was that someday, if it was safe, Isabella might find you and tell you the truth about why she had to disappear. Is it safe now? Carlos Santos died 20 years ago, a bitter, violent man who drank himself to death in a cantina in Mexico City. The danger that drove Elena north, that danger is gone. Silas sat in the wreckage of the railroad car, surrounded by the debris of his carefully constructed understanding of the past, and tried to comprehend what Father Sandoval was telling him. Elena was gone, truly gone this time, dead for 26 years. But Isabella was alive. The daughter Elena had died protecting. The little girl who'd survived the fire and grown into a woman was waiting across the border with answers to questions Silas had been asking for 30 years. Would Isabella want to meet me? Mr. Duvall, she's been praying for this day since her mother died. Elena made her promise to find you if the danger ever passed, to tell you that your kindness to her mother was not forgotten, that the love you offered was real, even if Elena couldn't return it completely. Father Sandoval reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. This is where you can find her, but I must warn you, seeing you will bring back painful memories for Isabella. The night of the fire, watching her mother choose between staying with you and protecting her daughter, it has haunted Isabella all her life. Silas took the paper, his hands shaking. An address in Guadalupe, Mexico. The place where Elena had taken Isabella to die in peace, where the daughter had grown up, knowing her mother had sacrificed love for safety, where answers waited for questions that had shaped 30 years of solitary grief. "Thank you," Silas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for coming." As Father Sandoval left, Silas remained in the railroad car until full darkness fell across the desert. In his vest pocket, he carried a birth certificate and an address that proved Elena had survived the fire, but not the life that came after it. He'd spent 30 years mourning a woman who'd died twice, once in the flames of a train wreck, and once more in a small Mexican town where she'd finally found the safety she'd always sought. But Elena's daughter was alive. And perhaps, in meeting Isabella, Silas could finally understand the woman he'd loved but never really known. The piece of paper Father Sandoval had given him felt heavier than gold in Silas's weathered hands. Isabella Santos Herrera, Calle de la Iglesia 47, Guadalupe, Mexico. Such simple words to hold the weight of 30 years' worth of questions, 30 years of grief, 30 years of building a life around a love story that had been only half true. For 3 days after the priest's visit, Silas carried that address everywhere in his vest pocket during the day, on his nightstand while he lay sleepless through the dark hours, clutched in his palm as he walked the boundaries of his ranch, trying to decide what to do with the information that could either heal him or destroy what little peace he'd managed to construct from the wreckage of his marriage. Jake found him on the 4th morning, sitting on the porch at dawn, a cup of coffee growing cold in one hand and the address in the other. "You look like a man wrestling with angels, boss," Jake said, settling his old bones into the chair beside Silas with a grunt of effort. "Maybe I am." Silas held up the paper. "Father Sandoval left me this, Elena's daughter's address. She's alive, Jake. She's a teacher in a little town just across the border, and she's been waiting 30 years to meet me." Jake was quiet for a long time, his weathered face reflecting the complexity of emotions that Silas himself was struggling to navigate. Finally, the old cowboy sighed. "What are you afraid of, boss?" The question hit deeper than Silas expected. "I'm afraid of what I'll see when I look at her. I'm afraid she'll have Elena's eyes, Elena's smile. I'm afraid I'll see the woman I loved and remember that she was never really mine. Or maybe you'll see something else entirely. Maybe you'll see a daughter who's grateful to the man who gave her mother a safe place to hide when she needed it most. What if she hates me? What if she blames me for not protecting Elena better? What if seeing me just reminds her of the worst time in her life? Jake pulled out his tobacco pouch and began the ritual of rolling a cigarette, his hands moving with the practiced ease of 70 years. What if she doesn't? What if meeting you gives her peace? What if it gives you peace? Silas looked out across his ranch, 20,000 acres of good grazing land, 300 head of prime cattle, a house that had been built for a family but had housed only loneliness for 3 decades. Everything he'd built, everything he'd accumulated, all the wealth that meant nothing without someone to share it with or pass it down to. I don't know how to be anyone's family anymore, Jake. I've been alone so long I've forgotten how to be anything else. Maybe that's exactly why you need to make this trip. The decision, when it finally came, felt as inevitable as sunrise. That afternoon, Silas found himself in the bedroom he'd shared with Elena for those brief, brilliant months, pulling his old traveling case from the closet and trying to remember how to pack for a journey that wasn't about cattle prices or business negotiations, but about the human heart and its capacity for hope. He chose his clothes carefully, his best suit, the one he wore to church on the rare Sundays when loneliness drove him to seek the comfort of other people's prayers. A few clean shirts, his shaving kit, the gold watch that had belonged to his father, and, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, the wooden horse Elena had carved for the daughter she'd never stopped loving. Jake insisted on accompanying him, despite Silas's protests that this was something he needed to do alone. "Boss, you're 72 years old, you haven't been more than 50 miles from this ranch in 20 years, and you're about to ride into Mexico to find a woman who might not want to be found. You need someone watching your back. It's not dangerous anymore. Father Sandoval said Carlos Santos is dead." "Maybe, but you're still a rich gringo carrying cash in a country where rich gringos sometimes disappear. I'm coming with you," and that's the end of the discussion. The next morning found them on the train to El Paso, Silas staring out the window at landscape that grew increasingly familiar as they traveled south. This was the same route Elena had taken 30 years ago, fleeing north from whatever hell Carlos Santos had made of her life. Now Silas was retracing her journey in reverse, seeking the daughter she died protecting. The irony wasn't lost on him. Elena had ridden these rails running from her past. Silas was riding them running toward it. The train's rhythm lulled him into a kind of waking dream where past and present blurred together like heat waves over desert sand. He could almost see Elena sitting across from him, her dark hair catching the light from the window, her eyes holding secrets she'd never shared. But this time, instead of wondering what she was thinking, he knew. She'd been planning her escape, mentally rehearsing the conversation she'd have with Isabella when she arrived, probably praying that her little girl was safe and that Carlos hadn't found them. In El Paso, they hired horses and a guide, a weathered vaquero named Rodriguez, who knew the border country and could navigate the maze of small roads that led to Guadalupe. The town wasn't on most maps, Rodriguez explained. It was the kind of place people went to disappear, to start over, to raise children away from whatever had driven them from their old lives. The perfect place for a woman fleeing an abusive husband to build a new life with her daughter. As they rode south through country that grew increasingly Mexican with each mile, adobe houses replacing wooden ones, Spanish replacing English in the conversations they overheard, Catholic crosses marking intersections instead of Protestant churches, Silas felt 30 years of carefully constructed American rancher identity begin to fall away. Out here, he wasn't the wealthy widower from Millfield. He was just an old man on horseback, carrying his grief and hope in equal measure, looking for a woman who might hold the keys to understanding the only love story his life had ever known. They stopped for the night in a small village whose name Silas never learned, sleeping in a one-room inn that smelled of beans and wood smoke, and the kind of poverty that wasn't bitter, but simply accepted as the way things were. Lying on a thin mattress with Jake snoring softly on the cot beside him, Silas stared at the ceiling and tried to imagine what he would say to Isabella when he finally met her. How did you greet the daughter of the woman you'd loved and lost twice? How did you explain 30 years of mourning someone who'd been trying to save her child? How did you ask forgiveness for not being strong enough or smart enough to protect them both? The questions followed him into restless sleep and were still there when he woke to Rodriguez, shaking his shoulder in the grey hour before dawn. "Guadalupe is only 4 hours' ride," the guide said in heavily accented English. "We can be there before the sun gets too hot. 4 hours." After 30 years of questions, after 3 months of searching through the ruins of a railroad car, after a lifetime of building walls around his heart to keep the pain from becoming unbearable, he was 4 hours away from meeting the daughter Elena had loved more than life itself. As they rode through the morning light toward a town that might hold redemption or might hold the final destruction of every illusion he'd cherished about his marriage, Silas touched the wooden horse in his saddlebag and tried to prepare himself for whatever truth was waiting at the end of his long journey through the wreckage of love. Isabella Santos Herrera was either going to heal him or break him completely. After 30 years of half-life, of wealth without purpose and days without joy, Silas was finally ready to discover which it would be. Guadalupe wasn't much more than a wide spot in the road where desert met sky in shimmering lines of heat. Adobe houses clustered around a small church like children gathering around their mother's skirts, and the single street was dust and stones baked hard by generations of Mexican sun. But there was life here, children playing in doorways, women hanging laundry on lines strung between houses, old men sitting in whatever shade they could find, talking in the slow cadence of people who had learned that time moved differently in small places. Silas felt his heart hammering against his ribs as Rodriguez led them through the town toward Calle de la Iglesia. Every woman they passed might be Isabella. Every face that turned toward them might carry Elena's features, might hold the answers he'd been seeking for 30 years. The house at number 47 was small but well kept, painted white with blue trim and a garden full of flowers that seemed impossibly bright against the desert landscape. A wooden fence surrounded the property, and through the slats Silas could see children playing in the yard, 2 boys and a girl, their laughter carrying on the warm afternoon air. "This is the place, senor," Rodriguez said, dismounting and tying his horse to a post. "You want me to wait?" Silas nodded, not trusting his voice. Jake swung down from his horse and came to stand beside him, solid and reassuring as always. "You ready for this, boss?" Silas touched the wooden horse in his coat pocket, Elena's final gift to the daughter she'd loved more than her own life. "I don't think anyone's ever ready for something like this." They walked through the garden gate and up the stone path to the front door. Before Silas could knock, the door opened and a woman stepped out onto the small porch. Isabella Santos Herrera was 54 years old, but Silas would have known her anywhere. She had Elena's dark hair, now streaked with silver, and Elena's warm brown eyes. But there was something in her face that Elena's had never carried, a deep peace, the settled contentment of a woman who had found her place in the world and made it her own. "Mr. Duvall," she said in accented English, her voice soft but steady. "I have been waiting for you for a very long time." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. She knew who he was. Somehow, after 30 years, she recognized him. "Isabella," he managed, his voice rough with emotion. How did you know?" "Father Sandoval sent word that you might come. And besides," she smiled, and for a moment Silas saw Elena in that expression, the same warmth, the same gentle humor. "My mother described you to me many times. The tall gringo with kind eyes who gave us safety when we needed it most." Silas felt tears burning his eyes. "Your mother, Elena, she told you about me?" "Si. In the end, when she was dying, she told me everything. About the ranch, about the wedding, about the man who loved her, even though she could not tell him the whole truth." Isabella stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. "Please come inside, we have much to talk about." The interior of the house was simple but comfortable, filled with the warm light that came from windows positioned to catch the best of the day. There were photographs on the walls, children at various ages, a wedding picture of a young Isabella in white lace, an older man who must have been her husband, now deceased according to Father Sandoval. But it was the photograph on the mantelpiece that stopped Silas cold. Elena, young and beautiful, holding a little girl with dark curls and serious eyes. Mother and daughter, captured in a moment of happiness that Silas had never been part of. "That was taken just before we came north," Isabella said, following his gaze. "Mama was so frightened, but she was trying to be brave for me. She always tried to be brave." Isabella moved to a wooden chest in the corner of the room and pulled out something wrapped in yellowed tissue paper. When she unwrapped it, Silas's breath caught. It was a letter, written in Elena's careful script. "She wrote this for you," Isabella said, holding it out with trembling hands. "Before she died, when the fever was making her remember things she had tried to forget. She made me promise that if I ever found you, I would give this to you." Silas took the letter with hands that shook so badly he could barely hold the paper. Elena's final words, written for him but delivered 30 years too late. The last conversation they would ever have, preserved in ink and paper, and the faithful memory of the daughter who had carried it all this time. "She loved you," Isabella said quietly. "Not the way she loved my father at first, not the way she loved me, but truly. She said you were the only man who ever made her feel safe just by being kind." Silas looked down at the letter in his hands, Elena's familiar handwriting blurred by his tears. After 30 years of questions, after months of searching through the ruins of a burned-out railroad car, after a lifetime of building his identity around loss, he was finally going to hear Elena's voice again. But first, he had something to give in return. Silas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the wooden horse, unwrapping it carefully from the cloth he'd used to protect it during the journey. The carved toy looked small and weathered in his large hands, but Isabella's gasp when she saw it filled the room like music. "Mama's horse," she whispered, her eyes bright with tears. "She was making it for me, for when we could be together again. I thought it was lost in the fire." "She had it with her on the train," Silas said, holding it out to Isabella. "I found it in the railroad car. She must have been carrying it to give to you." Isabella took the horse with reverent hands, cradling it against her chest the way she must have cradled dolls as a child. "All these years, I wondered what happened to it. She worked on it every evening by lamplight, telling me stories about the beautiful horse that would carry me away from all our troubles." "Tell me about her," Silas said quietly. "Tell me about Elena after the fire. Tell me about the woman she became when she didn't have to be afraid anymore." Isabella set the wooden horse carefully on the table and gestured for Silas to sit in one of the simple wooden chairs. The afternoon light streaming through the windows caught the silver in her hair, and for a moment she looked exactly like Elena might have looked at 54 if she'd lived to see her daughter grown. "After the fire, Mama was different," Isabella began, settling into the chair across from him. "The fear that had followed us from Mexico, it was finally gone. Carlos couldn't hurt us if he thought we were dead. But the smoke she breathed that night, the injuries from escaping the burning car, they never healed properly." Isabella's voice grew soft with memory. "She got work teaching in the mission school, just like she had done before she married you. The children loved her because she was gentle but firm, and she understood what it meant to be afraid. She taught them that learning was a way to build a life that no one could take away. Was she happy? I think yes, in her way. She was at peace. But she carried sadness too, especially in the evenings when she thought I wasn't watching. She would sit by the window and look north, toward where you were, and I could see the weight of what she had given up." Isabella reached across the table and touched Silas's weathered hand. "She told me about your wedding day, about how you picked wildflowers for her bouquet because you wanted everything to be perfect. She told me about the garden she planted at your ranch, how you would sit together on the porch in the evenings planning the future. She never stopped treasuring those memories. Silas felt something ease in his chest, a knot of pain that had been there so long he'd forgotten it wasn't supposed to be part of him. I thought she regretted marrying me. I thought I was just a convenience, a way to hide, until she could collect you. Oh no, Signor, you were much more than that. You were hope. You were proof that not all men were like my father, that kindness existed in the world. Mama said that knowing you gave her faith that someday I might find a good man too. Isabella's eyes grew distant. She used to say that if she could have brought you with us, if she could have told you the truth about me and you had still wanted us both, it would have been the perfect life. But she was too afraid that you would think less of her for having a child with Carlos, too afraid that Carlos would somehow find us if she stayed in one place too long. The children from the yard came running into the house, then 2 boys who looked to be about 8 and 10, and a girl, perhaps 12, all with Isabella's dark eyes and something indefinable that reminded Silas of Elena. "Abuela," the little girl said, stopping short when she saw Silas. "Who is the Señor?" "This is Mr. Duvall," Isabella said, rising to put her arms around the children. "He was married to my mama a long time ago, before you were born, before I was grown." The oldest boy studied Silas with frank curiosity. "Are you our abuelo then?" Isabella laughed, a sound so much like Elena's that Silas felt his heart skip. "In a way, Mijo, in a way, he is." As the children settled around the table, chattering in rapid Spanish about their day at school, Silas looked around the small room and felt something he hadn't experienced in 30 years, the warm chaos of family life. These children carried Elena's blood, her legacy, the future she had died protecting. And somehow, through the strange workings of love and loss and time, they were connected to him too. Isabella handed him Elena's letter again. "Read it now, Señor. Read what she wanted you to know." With trembling fingers, Silas unfolded the paper and began to read his wife's final words, written in the fevered hours before death took her from the world for the second and final time. In the background, children's laughter filled the spaces between his heartbeats, and for the first time in 30 years, the sound of family felt like coming home. 6 months later, the railroad car sat transformed in Silas's front yard, no longer a monument to loss, but a memorial garden blooming with desert roses and sage. Jake had built wooden benches around it, and Isabella's grandchildren had helped plant the flowers during their first visit to Nevada, their laughter echoing across the desert as they worked the soil with small hands and large hearts. Elena's final letter, which Silas had read aloud that day in Guadalupe, with tears streaming down his weathered face, now rested in a frame on his mantelpiece. Her words had been simple but profound, asking forgiveness for the deception, while explaining that every moment of their marriage had been precious to her, even though she couldn't give him the whole truth. "Mi querido Silas," the letter had begun. "If Isabella finds you, it means Carlos can no longer hurt us and the danger has finally passed. I want you to know that our love was real, even though I came to you carrying secrets. You gave me 3 months of peace in a life that had known little peace, and you gave Isabella a stepfather's love, even though you never knew she existed. That kindness lives in my heart as I write these words, and I pray it will comfort you when you read them." Now Silas stood on the same porch where he'd spent 30 years in solitude, but the landscape of his life had changed as dramatically as the memorial garden. Isabella lived in the small house he'd built for her near the main ranch, teaching at the Millfield school 3 days a week and tending to her grandchildren the rest of the time. The children, Maria, Diego, and little Carlos, named for the grandfather they'd never known, but carrying none of his violence, had turned the ranch into something it had never been, a place where family flourished. Dr. Hendricks visited more often now, drawn not by concern for Silas's mental health, but by genuine pleasure in the man's transformation. The bitter hermit had become a doting grandfather figure, teaching Diego to rope and ride, helping Maria with her schoolwork, carrying little Carlos on his shoulders around the property while the boy shrieked with delight. "I was wrong to worry about you digging up the past," the doctor had said during his last visit, watching Silas help Diego saddle a gentle mare. "Sometimes the past is exactly what we need to dig up to find our future." Sheriff Crawford had stopped expressing concerns about Silas's mental state around the time Isabella and the children moved to the ranch. It was hard to argue that a man was losing his grip on reality when his reality included 3 generations of family gathered around his dinner table every evening, speaking a mixture of Spanish and English that somehow made perfect sense in the warm chaos of their shared life. Jake had surprised everyone, including himself, by taking to the role of honorary uncle with the enthusiasm of a man who'd spent his entire life around cattle and discovered he was actually meant to be around children. He taught them cowboy songs and whittled them toys from mesquite wood, and in return, they filled the ranch house with the kind of noise and energy that made even the longest days feel too short. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most to Silas. Evenings, when he and Isabella would sit on the porch after the children were asleep, sharing stories about Elena Isabella, contributing memories of the woman who'd raised her alone, Silas adding details about the woman who'd brought such brief, brilliant joy to his early life. Together, they created a complete picture of Elena Santos Duvall, a woman who'd loved fiercely and sacrificed everything for her daughter's safety. "She would have loved seeing this," Isabella said one evening, watching her grandchildren chase fireflies in the garden. "All of us together, safe and happy. This is what she dreamed of when she was planning our escape, a place where family could grow without fear." Silas nodded, feeling the truth of those words settle into his bones. Elena's sacrifice had created this moment, this second chance at family that he'd never expected to find at 73. Her deception had been born of love, not malice, and the love she'd been protecting now surrounded him like warm light. The photograph on his mantelpiece had changed too. Instead of just Elena's portrait, it now held a new family picture. Silas surrounded by Isabella and her grandchildren, Jake standing proudly beside them, all of them squinting into the desert sun and smiling like people who'd found exactly where they belonged. On Sundays, they visited Elena's grave in the small cemetery behind the mission church in Guadalupe, bringing flowers and stories and the news that her daughter had finally found the safety she'd died trying to secure. The children would play quietly among the headstones, while Silas and Isabella sat beside Elena's resting place, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting in the peaceful silence of people who'd made their peace with the past. The railroad car still stood in their yard, transformed from a symbol of loss into a reminder of love's complexity. Children played in its shadow, flowers bloomed around its rusted wheels, and sometimes Silas would sit on one of Jake's benches and remember the day he'd first stepped inside, searching for answers about a tragedy that had shaped 30 years of his life. He'd found his answers, all right, just not the ones he'd expected. Love, Silas had learned, was more complicated than the simple story he'd been telling himself for 3 decades. Elena had loved him, but not completely. She'd married him for protection, but that protection had become genuine affection. She'd deceived him, but the deception had been born of desperation and the fierce love of a mother protecting her child. And in the end, that complex, imperfect, sometimes painful love had led him to the family he'd always wanted, but never thought he'd find. Elena's legacy lived in Isabella's gentle strength, in her grandchildren's laughter, in the peace that had finally settled over the ranch like evening light. As the sun set over the Nevada desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Silas Duvall sat surrounded by the sounds of family and felt, for the first time in 30 years, completely at home.